Japanese internment affected Washington by affecting jobs and businesses. It also changed Washington by taking innocent citizens. A final way it affected Washington is by sparking riots and political parties to step up on the controversy over Japanese Americans. Japanese internment. The racial resentment part of Japanese internment happened in 1941 after the effects of Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor didn't just kickstart racial resentment towards Japanese Americans and Japanese citizens, it also caused the deaths of over 2,000 people. On top of that, Pearl Harbor initiated America's entry into World War II. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed his famous Day of Infamy speech, and Congress overwhelmingly declared war on Japan. Following these events, Executive Order 9066 was enacted in 1942 on the 19th of February. Executive Order 9066 didn't just change how U.S. thought of Japanese Americans who were considered as spies, it also changed the way in which they dealt with them. Executive Order 9066 allowed the U.S. to designate restricted military areas that were turned into camps to intern Japanese Americans. This politically affected Washington and America because they proceeded to involve themselves with World War II, spending loads of money to fight. Additionally, the events of Pearl Harbor and Executive Order 9066 caused activists to step up. Some were against the internment and some were supporting the internment. Tom Clark advocated for the first removal of Japanese Americans and helped coordinate the program that evacuated and removed Japanese Americans. Although Tom Clark regretted that decision later in life, calling it one of his biggest mistakes, no amount of apologies could erase his participation in the removal. Gordon Hirabashi stood up against the curfew and resisted it, showing how even when they were hated the most, they still managed to find the strength to stand for their rights. The Japanese internment heavily impacted the economics of agriculture, as 45% of employed Japanese were farmers. Japanese farmers faced resentment from white West Coast farmers because the farmers wanted to eliminate competition. The Meiji Restoration created economic turmoil as the demand for Californian fruits and vegetables skyrocketed to prices almost unheard of. Japanese people produced 9% of the truck crops, making their internment a major loss. Shortages in many commodities developed due to the demands and shortages of crops. Japanese people who were in the camps were allowed to temporarily leave the camps for agricultural purposes to quote-unquote save the crops. The internment of the Japanese left a heavy impact on the social status and awareness of people. It made white people resent the Japanese even more and showed how the U.S. dealt with problems like surprise attacks, spies, and more. Japanese families were ripped apart, with many losing family members or pets. The families were forced to leave their homes and board up their stores and businesses, which were raided after they left. When the Japanese Americans were taken to the camps, it was not a pleasant process. The Japanese Americans were packed into buses, trucks, and trains to travel. The vehicles were often boarded up to prevent anything disruptive. The quality of the camps were not good either. They had dusty bread, no furniture, and long lines everywhere. Inmates had to make their own furniture as they only had cots. Privacy was not valued that much as the mail was censored before it was sent. The Japanese Americans were only given a few days to gather their belongings and get transported to the camps. Families were forced to give up tons of acres of land, with many losing their businesses after returning. The survivors were given $28,000 as compensation, but weren't paid until years later. Washingtonians were divided up by their regions, like Puyallup or Manzanar. However, we will chat about that next time. For now, let's just rest in the thought of the U.S. accusing the Japanese Americans of being spies and interning them without any real proof, creating generational trauma. This documentary film is dedicated to all of the Japanese Americans who were interned during that time, and all of the Japanese people who fought in World War II for the U.S. For the citizens who fought and put their life on the line for a country that mostly hated them.